In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. All right, so let's continue where we left off. So last time we looked at verses 2 and 3 and saw that Saint Maximus presents a kind of ladder, a kind of way to ascend, starting with the fear of God, or starting with faith. Starts with faith. And it's what faith, because you have to believe there's a God, that there's a reason for things, that there's that God is actually at work in the universe, right? It's not just a matter of luck. It's not just a matter of, it's neither just luck on the one hand, nor is it our fate on the other hand. No, we believe in a God who's actually providentially at work in the universe for my salvation, and that then creates a sort of fear of God, because if I start to despise God and ignore Him, or ignore His commandments, or ignore the people He puts in my life, then He'll get my attention. Life has a really I've often said that God is, that pain is God's little gift to us to say, attention, attention, oh yeah. It works marvelously well. So, and this fear of God then motivates us to control ourselves to a certain extent. And this control is just purely external, right? I just make myself do what I should do or not do what I shouldn't do, even though the passions are raging inside me. Why do I do that? I do it out of fear of God, right? And that creates a kind of suffering. But this, now I am already a martyr. Do you realize that? You're already living a martyric life because for Christ's sake, you are willingly enduring suffering. Right? We used the example of ice cream last time. Someone told me they really liked that example. But I'm using ice cream as this huge image of all the kinds of things that passions that attack us, right? And by me willingly suffering my self-imposed deprivation and not having the ice cream, I'm bearing witness of Christ. I'm at least beginning to bear witness to Christ, right? I'm certainly not Andronicus yet, the saints we celebrated today. I'm not there yet, but I'm on that road. And so, in a certain sense, I'm going that way. I'm being saved, right? And what that produces a kind of hope in God, right? I have this hope in God. And that hope in God shifts my perspective away from the pain or the discomfort or the fear or whatever the thing is that I'm resisting inside me. Anger. Turns my attention away from it to God, who is my hope. And so I begin to despise in the true meaning of the word. Not despise in the sense of hate, but despise in the sense of not even think it's worth my attention. Like St. Paul says, I consider the sufferings of this life not even worthy to be compared to the glory that's going to be revealed. There's a man with intense hope in God, right? And that's what happens when we begin to endure a certain suffering for Christ's sake. we begin to gain this kind of hope that St. Paul had. And the fruit of that hope is dispassion, right? The fruit of that hope is suddenly I'm not craving ice cream like I used to. And if the craving does bother to lift up its head, I despise it. It doesn't mean anything, right? You know, very holy saints, like one of my favorite examples is Moses the Ethiopian. After many years of very hard, very strict asceticism, still were tempted by thoughts of sexual sin. But he despised them. And then eventually his father, his spiritual father said, enough of this, laid hands on him, and he never was tempted with it again. After many years, right? So this idea that dispassion doesn't mean that you don't have the thought or don't notice that your body is drawn a certain direction or you don't notice that someone's annoying you. No, you notice all that stuff. You just despise it. It doesn't mean anything to you anymore because your hope is in God and your attention is there. And like you say, it may happen like it did happen to Moses, and I've known it to happen to people where, God takes away your appetite for ice cream or whatever the thing is, right? And I've known people who have really hated, and that hate over decades was transformed into pity, which is a big kind of love. Pity is a kind of love. So that can really happen. I've known people that that's happened to. So, but again, it's this process. It's this ladder that Maximus, and then dispassion blossoms into love, right? As St. Anthony the Great is famous for saying, I used to fear God, now I love him. Right? That it starts in one place, faith and the fear of God that's produced, but it matures into just complete entrustment with God. In fact, you even get saints like some of the contemporary saints. I believe it was Father Roman, who I don't know if he's declared a saint yet, but prison camps in Eastern Europe, that terrible, terrible experience. And in his book, or maybe it was Father Borga of Romania, I don't remember which one said this in his book, says, I am pleased to go to hell if that's where the love of God sends me. Of course, this is a man who already spent 25 years in hell in communist prison camps, right? I mean, what's worse than that? And, right? But he encountered the love of God there, so he's dispassionate about it, right? Because he's caught up in the love of God. All right, so that's what we talked about last time. And then, so today we're going to continue with, I hope we can get through 4 to 7 or 4 to 8 today of St. Maximus's first 100 sayings on love. Now, what he's going to do in verse 4 is pick up the theme from the very first verse. So the very first verse was, love is a holy state, disposing it to value knowledge of God above all created things. And so in the next 10 or 12 verses, he's going to talk about what it means to value and what the knowledge of God is. And so he's going to start by talking about what it means to value. So in verse 4 it says, the person who loves God values knowledge of God, right, more than anything created by God. So that's just a paraphrasing of the first verse, right? He's just saying it again. But then he goes on to say, in the first verse, he says, you can't hang on to it if you're attached to worldly things. Here he says, you value the knowledge of God more than anything else, and you pursue such knowledge ardently and ceaselessly. I find pursue a real important word here. Because what's interesting about what do you pursue, right? If I have something, then I'm not pursuing it. Right? And so he's talking about the person who loves God has this state already in it where it values the knowledge of God above all things, which he says in verse 1. But now in verse 4 he's saying, and is pursuing it. So you both have it and you don't have it. Because God is infinite. God's really big. Right? Really big. In fact, St. Gregory of Nyssa went so far as to say something along the lines of, we have to begin. We have to make a beginning and take a first step towards God. Not being depressed by the fact that this is about our millionth first step, and there's about 1 billion more first steps to go. We keep making the first step, right? But the reality is, each time I make the first step, which may seem to me to be exactly the same first step I made 10 minutes ago, 10 hours ago, yesterday, the day before, it's not exactly the same first step. Because I'm not exactly the same person I was 10 minutes ago. The circumstances of my life are not exactly the same as they were 1 hour ago. And so this is why people will often come to confession. Oh, Father, I did it again. Father, I keep doing, I keep saying the prayer. I keep resisting, but the temptation comes back. But this. Well, so am I damned? The question is in their mind, am I damned? It doesn't seem to be working for me, Father Michael. What do I do? I said, well, you keep doing what you're doing, because this is how it works. This is what it looks like when it is working. When it's not working, what it looks like is you don't give a damn and you just go back to the sin. That's what it looks like when it's not working. But when it is working, you're continually resisting. You're continually pushing. And it doesn't feel like you're going anywhere because you're continually pushing. We have in our head that we think, well, it's kind of like the naive gardener who thinks, if I just bend over and pull this weed, I won't ever have to do it again. But no, our life is a garden full of weeds, and some of them are very pernicious. They've got roots that go like for 20 feet underground, and they pop up and all over the place. And how can I kill this darn plant? Well, the way you kill it is every time you encounter it, you bend over and pull it up by as much of the root as you can, and then you go, some plants you have to burn. Others, some you can just throw on the ground and they'll compost, but others, if you throw them on the ground, they'll just re-root. Especially here, right, where it's so wet. And that was never a problem when I lived in California, right? It was never a problem. You got something out of the ground, it was going to die. It didn't reroot. But here, it reroots. All right, so, and this is what happens in our spiritual life. So, what's he saying? He's saying that when we love God, we not only value the knowledge of God, this knowledge of God that this love disposes us to love him above all created things, but we also pursue such knowledge ardently and ceaselessly. All right, so this is what it is to love God. It's both to have it and to pursue it. Why? And I think that's what verse 5 is about. Verse 5 sort of starts to answer this question. Why is it that we have to love God more than any created thing? So he explains, if everything that exists was made by God and for God, and God is superior to the things made by him, he who abandons what is superior, remember back up in verse 1 where he said the problem with being attached to worldly things is that we don't have lasting possession of the love of God, right? Or, lasting possession, of the love of God that values knowledge when we're attached to worldly things. So in verse 5, he's saying, look, we abandon what is superior and devote ourselves to what is inferior. We're showing that we value things made by God more than God himself. And of course, right, Romans chapter 1, verse 25. The fundamental problem with all the brokenness of humanity, St. Paul summarized, is they worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator. And one more thing, what was it? Do you remember, you guys? They were not thankful. Right? What does the word Eucharist mean? Show thanks, give thanks, be thankful. Right? So that's why the communion of the body and blood of Christ is so that's one of the, who could number the reasons why the Eucharist is so central to having any sort of stability in the life of a Christian. It's the way par excellence that we give thanks. It's how we give thanks. It's the way God gave us to give thanks. Look, if you don't want to give thanks, fine. But if you're going to give thanks, do it this way. This is the way he's given us to give thanks. And so we come and we stand and we say the prayers and we bring our offerings, right? Because part of giving thanks, right? In the Old Testament, they called it a thank offering, right? We bring our offerings. And I was explaining to Philip earlier, in the old days, they used to have a room in the entrance on the west end of the church where people came and they brought all their bread and wine and vegetable, whatever they were offering to God, they brought, right? And they even had a deacon there. Could you imagine if we did that these days? You come into church and there's a deacon there saying, okay, what you bringing? And collects it. What are you bringing? Right? And then at the point of the liturgy where we now do the great entrance, what used to happen is the priest and his entourage went out through the congregation of people who are now gathered. This is well into the liturgy. Everybody's there. Everybody's left their offerings in the back of the church. And he selects a loaf from all the breads that people brought, and some wine from the wine that people brought. And then he goes back up to the altar, right? Bringing the actual gifts that the people brought that day, right? And so it really is the Eucharist. It's our thank offering. Offering to God some of what He's given to us, we give back to Him, which He then gives back to us as Christ Himself, His body and blood. Right? This is the Eucharistic life. I receive everything from God and I'm thankful for it, therefore I give it back. Right? And there's all sorts of ways. Right? We give back by bringing gifts to the church, which I strongly encourage. The church is not supported by the state here in Canada, so without the gifts, the quality of my diet decreases dramatically, which is probably good for my soul, who knows. But that's not the only way, right? We give gifts by helping the poor, by all the various ways, Red Cross, all the ways that we can give back to God what He's given to us. And then, just as in the Eucharist, God finds some way to give it back to us again so that we can offer it to Him again. This is the life of thanksgiving. So, verse 5, right? This is what he's alluding to, is that problem in Romans chapter 1. We value things made by God rather than God Himself, and the result is all the kinds of perversions and screwed upness. Isn't that an interesting word, screwed upness? I don't think you'll find it in the dictionary, but it should be in their dictionary. All right. Then verse 6. So now he's going to go back to this theme of what it means to value, possess, to pursue the knowledge of God. He says, when your nous, or your intellect, okay, let's talk about that for a minute. The word intellect. When you go to university, just about everybody who goes to university has to take a psychology class, Introduction to Psychology. Psycho, the first word is the word soul. It's the words about the soul, psychology, that's what it means. And it's sort of the contemporary understanding of how our inner workings are, how our mind works. And presents a very, very different view from how the church understands how our mind works. Okay? So, in the church, when we talk about a human mind and how this process works, we talk about a mind, which we're using the word intellect. So throughout the Philokalia, the word that we would call mind is translated intellect. And it's the Greek word nous. N-O-U-S, nous. And this noetic part of us, this mind, would incorporate some of what we call heart in English. Right? It would also incorporate, it would have two aspects. It would have one aspect that relates to God that we might say is intuitive. And another aspect that relates to our physical body, our sensations, that we would call rational. Both are good. The noetic or intellectual, which again, in English, when we say intellect, we usually mean rational. But in the Philokalia, the way it was translated into English, they reserved that word intellect to refer to that part of our mind that is intuitive and relates to God. It's often equivalent to what we mean when we say things in English like, I know in my heart. I feel it in my heart, right? Jesus is in my heart, that sort of thing. All right, you know what? I've already gone a long time, so let's pick up next time talking more about this concept of nous, mind, heart, and because it's really central to understanding what Maximus is talking about. And then we'll go on, all right? All right, God bless you.